All right, so I'm going to continue with reading some of the details here for this Kuehn case, and I'm going to say that I'm going to run into some difficulty with, namely Kuhn's confession, um, and some other evidence that's presented in later on in the file. And I'm going to step back and I'm going to review what I've observed so far. And I'll say that for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that the less well supported assertions that'll come up in this next section, namely about intercepted diplomatic wires that are said in the FBI file to have taken place in July and August 1940. I'm going to concede that as being true. And I'm going to suppose what may have happened. Also, when I go to read Kuhn's confession, I'm going to make some observations about Kuhn at this stage. I have to. Could be cultural. It could be. I think there's a certain attitude that this couple had for my argument to work. uh, Clearly, they would have had a certain attitude to them. It's not necessarily bolsters their reputation as individuals, but nonetheless, I think isn't really condemning too badly. But I'm going to say that they had a certain arrogance and feeling of entitlement that other people were going to just do things for them because they asked. I'm also going to say this couple were hemorrhaging funds, and they just did not know how to, or had any realistic concept of budgeting. Very poor with their own finances, and there's a few things I'm going to mention that perhaps didn't occur to them, but there are some. I've been brainstorming. There are some holes in their story, and I'm going to, to make this. There's no point making a dishonest presentation. So, what that is just to get into this whole thing, and before I continue, just so you know up front, so it doesn't get too messy while I get into the details there. The story goes according to Kuhn's testimony, which we have yet to read in this details portion, but I've summarized. The general story is that Kuhn and his wife had trouble getting, or weren't allowed to get money out of Germany, so they had to work around this. Presuming we give to Kuhn as true, we believe that he had an aunt in Sweden, gave him $35,000 that he bought property with, spent the rest. Then he refinanced one property, sold another to keep his spending going, and then finally his wife had to liquidate her own separate property that was in Germany by getting into a business arrangement with a doctor. Yeah, his name isn't gonna. It's just summary. But the doctor that was doing business in Shanghai at some point, or at that stage, who I presume the profits of his work in Shanghai were being forwarded to the Kuhns in exchange for lands that were owned by Mrs. Kuhn in Germany. That's the way he paid for it. He made money in Shanghai, and then he would send the money to pay for the property that she owned in Germany to her by various means. And a lot of times she would actually go over there by boat and get the, one time she went over by boat and got the cash, put it in her hand, and traveled back. Two other times, a Japanese individual would come from Japan and at a random time and hand Mr. Kuehn $10,000 or $14,000 and then disappear. And what Mr. Kuehn is saying, and keep in mind there's this arrangement in place. There's property in Germany. You might even it's not unreasonable to believe that the property in Germany was income producing of some fashion. There was a small snippet that has either already come up or will come up in which when Mr. Kuehn came to America, he said he had money and properties that produced $5,000 a year of income, which is, it's just his best wishes and hopes. But probably there was some truth to it, and let's assume that there was some income, and I don't know this for sure, but let's assume that the property in Germany that she was going to sell for $40,000 was able to produce income that would go into the hands of eventually a guy in Shanghai. So somehow there'd have to be a way for the money to get from Germany to Shanghai. Her son Leopold's in Germany, and what Mr. Kuehn says is that he was no longer able to send a monthly check. He'll say this, no longer to send a monthly check of 50 marks to Germany from my bank. And so he got desperate, and he tried to go and ask the Japanese consulate to go ahead and deliver $500 cash that he handed to the consulate to his son-in-law, his wife's oldest son, who was who chances are great that he was an overall bad guy. Okay, so whatever. Setting that aside, we're talking about Mr. Kuehn. What his motives were, why he did what he did, to try to figure out whether he spied on the country. I thought about this, and why doesn't this person they have the arrangement with, why doesn't this person just, instead of sending the money over to Hawaii through some Japanese courier, there was still $10,000 due to, as this important part, she got a $6,000 down payment, $10,000 cash, $14,000 cash, property sold for $40,000. There's $10,000 still due to her. My thoughts are, why doesn't she just tell the guy in Shanghai that instead of sending $10,000 to Hawaii, send $9,500 to Hawaii and the other $500 to her son Leopold? That's what doesn't make any sense. Instead of doing that, he precludes that as a possibility for reasons unknown. It may have been impossible. It's possible that was impossible. And instead feels that he must. The only way he's going to get money. The only way he's going to get money to his son Leopold for his wife, who demands this no matter what. No matter what, you're going to do this. If you have to make arrangements to spy, you're going to send $500 to my son Leopold. That kind of demand. He chooses to go through the Japanese consulate. Now this gets back really to two observations that I've made about Mr. Kuehn, if in fact he and the question I have in mind is, just before Pearl Harbor, it's going to come to light, or maybe already has come to light, that just before the Pearl Harbor attack, the arrangements that Mr. Kuehn had in place, as verified by the wire from the Japanese government to the consulate, that involved using a Lanikai house with a dormer window to send signals to the government, could not have been done in the last month before the attack. It was impossible because there were 2 Navy officers living in that house. And unless we start supposing the 2 Navy officers were a part of this arrangement, which accusation never surfaced, I just don't believe it. I'm more inclined on that latest instance and that supposed latest set of signals that actually he was trying to double cross the Japanese government, in as much that what the Japanese government was going to do is in exchange for pretending to deliver $500 to their son Leopold, that Mr. Kuehn would provide them with statistics about the number of ships and vessels in the harbor. What also confuses this is that, yes, there were other Japanese agents on the ground. 2, that there were some cables that were sent back that seem, those cables, because the details reveal, I'm more inclined to believe give them veracity. Did send some information about some ship movements back to the Japanese government. It was sparse, but it was there. But this was, before a month had this was within that month time period where the communication couldn't have happened in the manner in which Mr. Kuehn had described, and indeed didn't happen by boat or anything from the Lanikai Hat. Just everything is excluded by the evidence they gathered. The FBI gathered evidence, and that evidence showed that every communication possibility Mr. Kuehn had in the month prior to the attack, that it was impossible to communicate, for Kuehn to communicate with the Japanese consul, who would turn the secret information over to the Japanese government. But what is not clear is that prior to that month before, from this let's say June 1940 until November 31st, 1941, it's not clear as to whether maybe he did supply some information and he's lying about a lot of the details in his story. And the way he puts things sometimes, and there are little confirming details in there that opens up a lot of questions. He had to write 2 confessions, and one had additional information in it. And the second one certainly didn't help him, and a lot of things he said really didn't help him, and in some cases were confirming. Now, I've seen one minor date irregularity that could probably, in the FBI files, that could probably be explained by the letter having been started to be written by typewriter on March 1st, the first paragraph completed, and then after the phone call on March 2nd, the letter was continued. But there still is one date irregularity there. I also note that what's very clear as to what's going on, and I'm going to review this because I think it's very important. The method the FBI was following is somewhat like, if you say it often enough, it becomes true. And I really do get that feeling. It really genuinely appears to, and just sleights of hand that like the Minnesota office writing a memo to confirm a phone call they received about information, and then there's a second piece of paper in the file by the DC office saying that the Minnesota office called them and supplied them with information. It seems like they would repeat things so often that it became true in the reader's mind. It was like hypnotism or something. Or sleights of hand. Like, I have to wonder that, when I get to reading that part of the file that doesn't provide specific wire transfers, but does in general say that there were several communications in July and August, I almost seem to think that one trick that they did is, of course, the two cable communications that they're talking about could be described as several. They seem to be repetitive. They seem to, and then so when someone reads it, most normal people would think that they're talking about additional wire transfers. So, but I'm not clear on that. I'm just saying that it seems like that kind of thing is going on. Now, getting to Mr. Kuehn, he just to comment on this, it seems like he more or less always seemed to have money coming from his relatives. He even admits that he doesn't put it this way, but you realize that the guy hemorrhaged an awful lot of money in a short amount of time when he lived in Germany. It seems like he was used to living this lavish lifestyle. What the FBI presupposes, of course, in their reports when they say that they entertain Navy officers lavishly, is that suddenly they drop their frugality as soon as the Navy officers walk in the door and start showering them with money. And then they go back to their frugal lifestyle. For the most part, people that are used to, for years, living a lifestyle where they've $50,000 back in 1913. Well, 50,000 is a good sum now. 19. It was a lot. It was a lot of money, and they could have gone on for quite some time. Living under arrangements where basically, in exchange for money, people were doing errands they ought to have been doing themselves and would have been easy for them to do themselves, that most people would do for themselves. And what I'm going to say is I think they got used to that. They got used to hemorrhaging their money. And they always look for someone to handle things for them rather than inventing solutions for themselves. This is what I think was their mindset. And I also think that Mr. Kuehn, when he wrote down his account, he was very detailed, but I don't think it actually never occurred to him to explain certain details that he knew that his or should have known or guessed that the people that were talking to him had interpreted in such a way that that it's not unreasonable to conclude that something else was going on besides what they were saying, especially when there are little bits and pieces of confirming information in there and little other nuances that are kind of like, whoa. And so that happens, and so there is an argument, and all that was for his guilt, true guilt, and let's separate that. So there's the guilt of the technical, giving to a foreign official who would later become our enemy the number of best guess of the number of boats in the harbor on a certain day that the consulate already was aware of himself, which is breaking the letter of the law. That's one thing, and the other thing is providing material support, giving them information they wouldn't otherwise have. I've yet to think that he's given them information that they otherwise would have. What I'm going to okay. Then I'm going to do a summary of what I think happened when I go through this narrative, and I'll comment on it as I go through it. But I'm also going to do it up front. So there's going to be some details in here. There's going to be information in the file that's mentioned once. The transcript of these cables are not provided, so there's some weight of doubt against that, but I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to assume these things happened, and I'm going to say this is what I think had happened. So I'm revising my story somewhat, or my interpretation of events. So the Kuehn started to run out of money in 1939, and it even mentions it in the file. We'll see that. And of course these people don't know. Everybody lives habitually. Okay. Instead of trying to figure out how they're going to cut their costs, they instead started to look for other sources of money. And I think what they did is they sat down and they thought to themselves, hey, we actually do have an awful lot of information from these Navy people about the workings. We've actually, obviously the Navy officers were alarmed about how much information they had provided to some extent, at least confidential informant ended. And I think that this occurred to them early in August 1940, that perhaps someone would be willing to pay them for that information. And I'm going to have to admit that they not only considered selling whatever information they thought they had to the Japanese government, but they actually drove down to the consulate. Both of them walked in the office, gave them a very weak false name, the Freidels. Of course, he was named to Freidel Burke. And asked the Japanese consulate whether they want to do business, and he said, "Well, let me talk to my superiors." And he did send a wire, if I believe these cables, and I'm going to choose to believe them. The existence of the cables, the contents which are described, and so the Japanese consulate did get back in touch with the Japanese government. It says, "Hey, there's a couple of guys I've never heard of showed up here. Look like they're Jewish or German, and they say they have information to sell us about America." It wasn't very clear. Have you guys heard of these guys? Because tell me about them. Japanese government takes a month to get back to them in August of 1940, and they say, "Well, we never heard of these fuckers. I don't know who they are, but you know what? If they have information, look it over. If it seems like it might benefit us, okay, pass it on and make sure to check them out. We want to make sure they're not double agents." Is implied. I imply that. Meanwhile, what I think happened is the Kuehns were so used to having large piles of money at their fingertips. They got nervous and they decided, well, they're not going to get, before the month had ended. They finally made their arrangement with the doctor in Shanghai and decided to do that, and gave up on doing anything for the Japanese consulate at that point. So Mrs. Kuehn, Friedel Burke Kuehn, went over to Japan and met with the doctor, the Shanghai doctor, who's, more details will be provided about him too. And he made a $6,000 down payment on the property, and then she took the boat back to Hawaii, and they had some money for a while. But they were at a point where they were starting to borrow money at the rate of spending. Then Mr. Kuehn was told by and this man was actually the fiance of their daughter. Was told, this is getting dangerous for me to have you come over here and meet me. And this is still 1940. Okay, I'm a little confused as to why they insist on carrying cash. I don't know enough about the banking system back in 1940 to know whether money could... Yeah, no, it could be wired, because Mr. Kuehn said that he wired money to his son in Germany up until July 1941. So, don't know why she insisted on going over and picking up the cash and having it in her hands and taking a boat back and forth to Japan rather than having the money wired, but nonetheless, that's what they did. Maybe they just didn't trust banks. They're willing to risk 50 marks a month, and he does say in there that he hardly ever put his money in the bank. However, and you probably, after having been cut off from money in the Netherlands, which may or may not be true, but he may have had learned to distrust banks. Okay, so that may explain it. Now, what I'm going to say now is when they went over to the Japanese consulate and they made their offer, and the Japanese consulate sat on it for a month, or had to wait a month for a reply, and then had a reply, but they didn't. The Kuehns were gone at that point. Their issue was not raised until sometime next year. And there's some other nuances. Basically, Kuehn had some contacts in Japan, and they knew where to find him, actually. Again, this is not black and white. So what I think happened is, once the offer was made, the Japanese government wanted to let the Kuehns know that they can do business with them. Now, the United States hadn't passed laws to restrict money to and from Japan or Germany until July 1941. But their tensions were high, and they were the United States was officially neutral, but war seemed like it could happen easily, and Japan and Germany certainly would be our enemies. In other words, Japan had some reason to seek out spies in America, but wasn't really all that intense about it. The Germans were more intense about it. Anyway, so wanting to show some good faith, they offered to the individual that was buying Mrs. Kuehn's land to deliver $10,000 when he had the money. The next installment, it was going to be paid in installments, to deliver it to Mrs. Kuehn. So on some trip to the consulate from the Japanese government, some official took a side trip over to Mr. Kuehn's and handed him $10,000 of cash in a brown bag. This was payment number 2, and this was from, according to Mr. Kuehn, was from, of course, the doctor in Shanghai who was buying the property in Germany. And it gets confusing. They have, he's the guy that's paying for this land doesn't want to talk with him directly, so Germany, just to recall, it's not unreasonable to believe, after all, the German government was somewhat paranoid. They would spy on their own people. They would reward people for reporting back to them any suspicious activities. And while the FBI's activity was secret to the public wasn't really aware. The public still isn't really aware of what the extent the FBI went to back in the 40s. The German public seemed to be aware of what the Nazis were doing, and I think they had much more bravado, felt much more entitled to do what they did, and were vocal and public about it, whereas the FBI was very overt and hidden about it. In other words, it's not out of the realm of reason to believe that the doctor who was working in Shanghai was concerned that if it was learned that money was sent back to the Kuehns, that he would get in trouble, because in effect he was allowing money to leave Germany, which, according to Mr. Kuehn, wasn't lawful. Now, I haven't confirmed that assertion. I've assumed it's true. And if I found out it wasn't true, it'd be a giant hole in the argument. But somehow I think it is true. Um, After all, the German government did go to every nation they conquered and hoarded their museums and treasures, and would even have places to do. Anyway, they definitely were after money. So the German government was definitely after money. Money was very important to them. I won't go into all the gruesome details about gold dental fillings that were collected. Just brush over it, and it's so disgusting, not worth glorifying it in any fashion by repeating it. So this happened the first time, and there is some discussion that Kuehn will get into in his second confession, some details about how when he did go to Japan and he had learned of Mr. Kuhn's military background with the German army. This was way early, like in 1936, probably even before the non-aggression pact was signed. The Japanese agent had expressed some interest of getting information from Mr. Kuehn, and supposedly Mr. Kuehn turned him down. Which will be important because he was involved in these money trades. And another point I'm going to make is I don't think Mr. Kuehn realized the concept of quid pro quo, or you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And basically, what had happened is that whatever Japanese official that was entertaining him at the time he was in Japan initially had asked Mr. Kuehn if he wanted to spy, and Mr. Kuehn allowed him to continue questioning him about stuff, and then after letting the guy go on for a while, suddenly says no. The guy didn't give up on, perhaps at some future time Mr. Kuehn would change his mind, and so told him, just remember when he left, just remember if you need anything from me or any favors from me, you know who to ask. Well, Mr. Kuehn didn't see the wink. He just thought that this guy just admires me and he just likes me. Some people just do that. Kuehn especially. Oh, he just likes me. He'll just do me a favor. The guy, this official sent him a Christmas card in 1936, and then kind of gave up on the idea and forgot about Mr. Kuehn, actually, or wasn't around to answer the inquiry that came in 4 years later in June 1940, as the Japanese government did respond saying, I don't know who this guy is, or wasn't in that loop, something, I don't know. Anyway, so he was arranging, this guy that was doing the favors arranged the money, and the first one, $10,000, nothing was stated. When the $14,000 arrived, Mr. Kuehn said that they specifically asked him to get a shortwave radio and conduct a test, and all Kuehn said was, oh, I can't do that. And so when he finally goes in there the last time to try to deliver $500 to his son Leopold in Germany, which is ridiculous. He could have found a way to work around that without using the Japanese consulate, I gather. Although, if Mr. Kuehn had concluded that he shouldn't try to directly involve his daughter's fiance in anything at that point in time, or perhaps maybe if his daughter had broken off the engagement at that point because she was I don't know exactly when she got married, but it wasn't that long after. She suddenly broke the engagement off with this doctor and married a Mr. Moore. So maybe the relationship with this doctor had broken down after the last money was delivered. But another point is the money didn't start showing up until Mr. Kuehn showed up after Mr. Kuehn showed up at the consulate. And he would do just the most ridiculous shit. There's some details, and there's like, why are you going to this? If this was true, why are you going to this length? There are a lot of the parts of the stories that seem to be unbelievable, and you can only sometimes wonder if you're dealing with Lloyd Christmas. So without further ado, and I'll comment as I go on with these things, but I guess I'll start. I'm just gonna check to see if my file has grown to over 2 gigabytes, which means I'll have to make another one of these. So and it hasn't, so we're not even halfway done. So picking up where I left off, I was still in this first of 9 packets of data from the FBI vault. And I'm probably going to rename my videos there, because this is a real head scratcher, I will say. And where we were, I believe, is in November. $1941, this right here. So I'm going to just read some of these details. Now this is quite surprising. In some respects. This was written by the Honolulu office. 24th November. Sometime around Thanksgiving. Recent activity of the Kuehns fails to indicate how this is coming out. Fails to indicate they were engaged in espionage activities at present time. Otto Kuehn scheduled to be formally admitted to U.S. citizenship January 1942. There's a lot of redacted stuff here. Supplemental custodial detention memoranda be submitted on blank with Otto Kuehn in there. I have no idea who's in custodial detention, why it's important, why the rest of the details would have been redacted, etc., etc., etc. It seems to me as though, and I'll tell you this time, by November, okay, that we have evidence here, that by November of 1941, their daughter, Ruth Moore, had married J. Carson Moore. And just to back up here, to get back to the arrangement that was made, here's a man that, and I will say, and I will add to what I was forget a couple other things. One, this Shanghai doctor in November of 1941 no longer, and this is a year and maybe a half after he had purchased the $40,000 of property from Mr. and Mrs. Kuehn in Germany, had delivered a down payment, and I'm not even so sure when the last payment had arrived. I guess I'll have to cheat here. In October 1941, $14,000 had arrived. So a month or two before this memo was written, and I don't know when, it would take some time for the money to arrive in October. So we'll just say September 1941 would have been about the time that Dr. Homburg had arranged to have made a $14,000 payment, if all this thing's to be believed, and which I've chosen to, and I'm assuming is true. There still would have been $10,000 due to Mrs. Kuehn, but that was September 1941, and then we only have October and November. Was this, in other words, if November 24th, 1941 was the marriage date, there would only be an additional month and a half for Dr. Homburg to deliver the additional $10,000 whilst he was still under the impression he was Ruth Kuehn's fiance at most. And I'm not here to judge how honest he was, but if he was slightly dishonest, he may have decided that he no longer had a reason to pay them the additional $10,000 after after the engagement was broken. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I'm just throwing that out as a possibility. All right, so let's get back to these details here. This is still from the November 24th date. There's a lot of redacted stuff in here. Under date of October 27th, 1941, Mr. and Mrs. J.P. Dillon of the Naturalization Office at the Immigration Station advised that Otto Kuehn filed a petition for citizenship on June 30th, 1941. That would be coming up for his final papers in December 1941 and will be formally admitted to citizenship the last Saturday of January 1942. I'm going to step back if I didn't mention this in the last few minutes. Another factor to consider is that that points to them living their lives as if everybody else is going to do the legwork for them for the most part is, there's no evidence to say that Mr. Kuehn's life was in danger if he returned to Germany to deliver the $500 himself. Now, these were recurring payments, but if he had decided to make a lump sum payment to make up for the fact that he wouldn't be able to make 10 smaller payments or just pay him off or something with a larger payment and no more lump sum, he would have been able to go there. And so he did end up in a concentration camp once, and they tried to throw him in on false charges a second time. But that, he says in his own account that he then after that tried to start a coffee business, and then only after it failed did he leave. So, by his own admission, his own perception, he didn't feel like his life was in danger to return to Germany, and certainly the Kuehns were at least frequent travelers to Japan. One would wonder why they wouldn't. They're so desperate to go to, get $500 that they had a clear choice between traveling to Germany themselves and handing Leopold, their son, the $500, or, and this is before the war, this was after July 1941, but before December 7th, or 8th, 1941. Clearly they did have the option to take a trip over there by boat to personally hand the money to their son, Leopold, rather than traveling to the Japanese consulate office and offering to or at least pretending, my contention is they pretended to offer top secret information. Now, obviously, it's easier just to go to the consulate and try to trick them rather than having to travel to Germany. to make a payment in lieu of monthly payments, of which they may have to go back again at some point. They have to guess how long that's going to have to continue. And if they give them too much, of course, they'll invade their own lavish budget, which they're quite used to hemorrhaging their own money. But this level of desperation seems almost counter to their personalities, but I view it more as is that the top dog in the house was Mrs. Kuehn, and Bernard Julius Kuehn knew exactly what his role was, but to the outside world, the couple thought that they were top dogs and everybody else needed to wait on them. Basically, that's so those are just two of the things to consider when you try to judge the veracity of his testimony. And one thing he doesn't state, of course, obviously, is that, well, I'm an individual who feels myself more entitled than most normal people do in the world, and I just don't realize this. He can't make that testimony, especially if he doesn't realize it. It's a ridiculous statement. Okay, so as of October 23rd, 1941, the address of Otto Kuehn, his wife Friedel, sons Martin Eberhard, which later was switched to Eberhard Martin, age 15, Hans Joachim, age 8, and then something's blocked out. The corner of Ohlone and Kalauer streets, there being no street numbers in that vicinity. Whether Mr. and Mrs. Kuehn is employed, both are reported to remain around the residence a greater part of the time. Martin Eberhard Kuehn is at present attending a school in Honolulu. The Kuehn's daughter Ruth, who, as reflected in reference report, recently married J. Carson Moore, is living with her husband in home Oakland. Okay. That report of her marriage has been completely redacted. Obviously, but derived here is now, their lifeline for funds has been put in jeopardy, so to speak. Has become clear is that, he'll say that, I forgot this guy's name, it's so complicated. I forgot the guy's name, but Dr. Homburg, obviously, when she married Mr. Moore, was no longer engaged to their daughter. It was no longer a family matter to get money to mother and father-in-law. Then there's a redacted paragraph after which, in parentheses, it says, this information seems to disagree with that developed to date in the investigation. On pages 6 to 18 of the reference report, information from the files of the Immigration Nationalization Bureau reflects Otto Kuehn first entered the United States as non-immigrant on April 29, 1935, on his way to Japan for purposes of studying the Japanese language with the intention of qualifying in such to hold interpreter or translator position in the mercantile field in probably Germany. He later returned from Japan to Honolulu on August 15, 1935 to study the Japanese language at the University of Hawaii. During questioning, and what's kind of strange about this, you'll find from Mr. Kuhn's, and this does not help his veracity at all. Confession is that there'd be times in his life where he'd suddenly be handed very large amounts of money. He would spend this money very quickly. And then when he was out of money or almost out of money, he would consider getting a job, and he tried everything. Doctor, steamboat operator, coffee salesman, you name it. I mean, he almost sounds like a flim-flam man if I were to make a resume for this guy. He seemed most determined at some point that he stuck with the Japanese language the longest, which is actually uncharacteristic of him, and you'll see that in his own testimony. And it's anyway. Let's get back to this. I thought I had a point to make, but maybe I didn't. So during questioning of Mr. Kuehn by the director of the Immigration and National Relations Bureau, Honolulu, January 2nd, 1936, Kuehn, there's some more redacted above it. Kuehn said he expected his wife and child to join him from Germany and to remain here for approximately 1 year, at which time the family would return to Germany. Both Mr. and Mrs. Kuehn afterwards made trips to Japan and returned to Honolulu as quota immigrants for permanent residence. There's something you had to do to become, and even in my lifetime, I had a friend of mine tell me that his family, trying to relocate from Lebanon, had to go to Cyprus for a while. Maybe he had an interview in Tunis or some, all these strange movements they had to do to be able to actually finally immigrate for the first time. And they had to go. They went to these places purposely. They couldn't just come to the United States. Don't know why that is, but apparently this is part of the whole thing. So it seems to me as if they were taking steps to actually get their citizenship. Just strange, but nonetheless true. Kuehn is described as a monarchist and speaks glowingly of the days of the Kaiser, which of course is when he fought in the war. And everybody thinks there's the good old days, so whatever. But that, again, this does, by implication, somewhat counter the regime change to that of the Nazis. And I hope one thing that's abundantly clear, at least at this stage, is that it seems pretty damned clear that Kuehn was not reporting or working with the Nazis. There's no evidence he did that. To say that he's a Nazi spy is more of a half-truth reconstruction of history. Yeah, at one point he did join the Nazi Party. And it is true that the man, if we're to believe what he said, and I do, didn't voluntarily leave the Nazi Party, but instead was kicked out. Doesn't really bode towards his character very well, at least in my mind. However, I do think he was the kind of individual that really probably didn't take the time to understand what the principles of the Nazi Party were. More or less just kind of went with the flow of the times and would just try things as he would run out of money. And that was the point I was going to make. And now, in reflection, now that he's out of Germany, I probably do think that he wished that the days of the Kaiser were back and the Nazis weren't in power. At least that's what he seems to tell his American colleagues, and I have no reason to doubt that he changed his mind. The point about his money is that he would suddenly, by surprise, get large inheritances either from his dad or his aunt in Sweden when he was piss poor broke and desperately scrambling for any occupation that would cross his path, from coffee salesman to attempted doctor. Okay, so getting back to this. Kuehn is described as a monarchist and speaks glowingly of the days of the Kaiser. He served in the German Navy during the First World War. At that time, he was interned for the greater portion of the war in England and was frequently spoken highly of his treatment by the English. All right, so now this is a memo from November 26th that continues in number 2 here. This is where we start getting into some of the more sticky items. Up to this point, we have, we clearly have the way I interpret it is, we clearly have some naval officer that was concerned that perhaps he had given too much information to an individual that seems to love countries that are aggressive and it's not unreasonable to think that someday we would be at war with. That is, both Japan and Germany. This individual, wanting to remain anonymous, informs the FBI, and the FBI balloons a small memo into repetitive statements and and then slight revisions thereof of of the original suspicion into graduating into fact at times, additional interviews and invasions of the man's privacy to gather a dossier that which eventually was used against him. And so and then from Bernard Kuehn's own words, he was a man who had pretty much trouble taking care of himself. Inheritances that would land in his lap would help sustain him, enough to the point where he almost had this kind of attitude that the world owed him customer service. And he just made some of the most egregious contact. We'll get into all that. So anyway, up to that point, that's basically for the perspective of the FBI. They're definitely watching this family, keeping track of everything. They kept in touch with this confidential informant, and as they find out any information about the family, they type it up and throw it in the file. Which, to my mind, is not the right thing to do. That's what courts are for. Once information is discovered, or there's a reason to actually arrest someone, you take them to court, and the confidential informant testifies. They don't pre-testify in the form of something typewritten in a file, and then there's some fabrication going on, at least a little bit in here, just to one agent claiming that the agent, the Minnesota agent claiming that the agent from D.C. had given him information, whereas the agent from D.C. claimed that the Minnesota agent had given him information. When meanwhile, they're just trying to find an excuse to throw additional details that the confidential informant had told them into the file. That's what I think happened. All right, so here's December 26th. This was written by Special Agent Shevers, who was very involved in the governing of Honolulu when it was under, Hawaii when it was under martial law. Written to the director of the FBI in Washington, D.C. Dear Sir, I'm transmitting herewith 5 copies of the above caption report rendered in the above manner by Special Agent in Charge R.L. Shevers in Honolulu, December 26th, 1941. Strange how this is done. So anyway, this is what Shevers wrote. The Office of Naval Intelligence, 14th Naval District, and the Office of G2 are aware of the contents of the messages quoted in this report and are generally informed concerning the full contents of this report. And by this report will be some of the content that I will read when I go to this. Fully informed concerning the full contents of this report. It is suggested, therefore, the Bureau not furnish copies of this report to ONI or MID in Washington, D.C., Office of Naval Intelligence, or the, I don't know what MID is, maybe that's the same thing as G2, in view of the reference made to the cryptographic section established by the Navy at Pearl Harbor, which is supposed to be one of the prime secrets in Honolulu. So basically, don't let them know we decoded their cables. Don't know why that would be. Honestly, we're at war now. December 26, 1941, we are at war. Mr. Kuehn is in custody. He and his family were arrested on December 8th. In fact, we're going to find out that on, if I haven't already shown it, that actually on December 17th, Mr. Kuehn was transferred to a facility that differed from the one that held his wife and children. Okay, so now this is, to explain this, why does this look more legible than before? This is a page from the page 3070 from the congressional investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the contents of this page match exactly pages 5 and 6 of a report that's in the Freedom of Information Act file. And the reason why I have this rather than this is because I could read this a lot easier than I could read this. And this is not redacted, but the other one may have been redacted. So whenever I could find, basically, from some other source, contents of the exact, matching exactly, that I'll substitute it with the contents that are more legible and matches exactly and are absent redactions, in hopes of shedding some more light on what goes on here. Now I have a red arrow here, and I'm doing an awful lot of explaining here, and this is probably going to be more of an interlude than a reading of details. I'm now 75% of my time has been exhausted, but my belief is the Japanese consulate probably felt that eventually these diplomatic cables would be decoded by the United States government at some point. And I really do believe that this Lanikai Beach House reference here is a poison pill. And I'm actually going to go back to some more details on that will be revealed when I read more stuff. And getting back, so, Kuehn, we're going back to 1936. Kuehn first went over to Japan. He's entertained by some Grand High Mucky Muck of the Japanese government, who inquires as to whether Kuehn is willing or ready to spy on the U.S. government. This is according to Kuehn himself. And Kuehn says he said no. Kuehn goes back. They get desperate. They try to go to the Japanese consulate. They don't hear an immediate reply, so they decide to sell the land to Germany to their daughter's fiance. Meanwhile, the Japanese government is motivated to deliver the money on behalf of their son-in-law. But when he was first there, the guy asked him, Kuehn said no, right? But still thought maybe he might come through in the long run. And so when they showed up at the consulate, obviously this individual eventually became aware of the offer that Kuehn had made to spy for the Japanese government, and was then willing to deliver the doctor's money to them. Okay, so they did him, basically from the Japanese point of view, they treated him very kindly in Japan. They established some kind of covert arrangement with the doctor to launder money out of Japan. On 2 occasions, they delivered the money, and there weren't small amounts. They could have just kept it for themselves, but they didn't. They actually delivered the money twice. And on the second occasion, they opened up the issue again and asked him to start spying for them, and he turned them down. And so they're starting to get pissed off at this guy. And then all of a sudden, after they'd given up on him and they thought this guy's just a flake, he shows up asking them to now be his delivery boy. And first they said no, and then he says, "Oh, okay, well, fine. I'll give you some information about the U.S. fleet. Here, let's And he comes up with this really overcomplicated. He's just kind of disappointing the whole time. They're pissed off at him, and eventually, when they finally think they have an agreement with Mr. Kuehn to send them information through light signals and all that, he doesn't actually do it. And so they're pissed off at him. And so what I think this is a poison pill. That is to say that this cable here they probably sent it under very light encryption to get him in trouble. That this was their way of telling the U.S. government that one of their foreign nationals that was living in Hawaii had offered to spy against them, and so puts in all these details here in hopes that the Lanikai House especially would lead back. One of the details would lead back to Mr. Kuehn. He'd get in trouble for it, and he sure did. That's what I actually believed happened. Because 4 days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, as this cable was sent, are they going to be talking about looking in a classified ad that might take a week to get public? It just doesn't. Or using a P.O. box, it makes no sense. So to my mind, this was actually them retaliating against Kuehn for not scratching their back after they had scratched his, basically. So here it is, December 3rd, 1941, from Kita to the foreign minister at Tokyo. Chief of from Fuji. This is on the 3rd. Signals I wish to simplify communications as follows. So to me it looks like the chief of the General Naval Staff, Fuji, wanted to simplify supposedly wanted to simplify these signals that Kuehn had come up with, and we'll get to that. The problem is you can't really put everything in date order because the dates of the documents, it wasn't revealed till it would take me a long time to actually put everything in specific order. I'm not going to read all these details. They're tedious, but you will see Chinese drug for sale at a P.O. box in a want ad. You'll see a Lanikai Bay dormer window, of which on December 3rd Mr. Kuehn could not send the signals because his place was being rented out. This was information the FBI learned, later clarified by Kuehn. Clearly he had them double-crossed, but I think clearly they knew he was. This is Lanikai Beach House, and I'm going to highlight this. Okay, so then 2 days later, Kita lets the foreign minister in Tokyo that 3 battleships mentioned in your X-239 on Friday morning, probably a higher level of encryption, entered port. They expected to port on the 8th. Same day the Lexington 5 Avery cruisers departed. So Kita knows and is aware of these things. And in fact, let's see, on his testimony, what does he say? He doesn't say what date. Does he say what date? This is in November. A lot of the details match, and that was their intent. Anyway, I think that the consulate was able to observe these things, or he had other agents, not necessarily Kuehn, finding out. There's no evidence to show that Kuehn had actually supplied this specific information here on the 5th. Okay, I'm going to read this, and I'm going to stop and go into the next details. Okay, so as soon as the translation of the above messages was received, Special Agent in Charge R.L. Shevers, someone who's crossed out, who's super secret, and Lieutenant Colonel George W. Mitchell, Ricknell, Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, took immediate steps to initiate the investigation with the purpose of locating the Japanese agents who had been assigned to the task. They followed the cheese. Here's some cheese, follow it, and they followed it. Assigned to the task of getting these signals out, presumably to enemy submarines off the shores of the island of Oahu. Now that absolutely does not make any sense. They're thinking that submarines are lifting up their periscopes and peering upon lights and dormer windows rather than the boats that are closer to them and more visible. Investigation was instituted by the Officers of Naval Intelligence to cover the station in Lanikai on the windowed side of Oahu. The FBI conducted an investigation at Kaloma, which is also on the windward side of Oahu, to locate the house with the dormer window, which was used to signal from 7 p.m. to 1 p.m. flashes that would indicate items 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. The FBI also conducted an investigation to determine whether or not there had been any advertisements over radio station KGMB want ads advertisements at 9:40 a.m. subsequent to December 1st, or any advertisements in any of the newspapers in Honolulu relating to items A, B, or C in the above quoted paragraphs. And that's what these are. Now, KGMB, I guess, was a radio station, actually, so that could have been timely. I'll give them that much. I don't know who would have been listening. Probably the consulate, right? What would the consulate listen to the radio station at 9:40 a.m. to find out what he could find out by peering out his window or driving down the street and observing the very large vessels that were in the bay? Probably not, but whatever. The FBI conducted the investigation to determine whether or not there was any ever. Okay. The Office of Naval Intelligence instituted an investigation on the island of Maui in an effort to locate and identify the person who would send out signals from that island. They just presume that the signals were sent, of course, which the FBI agents later on found out didn't happen. And you'll notice there's no document's going to say that the individuals working at the radio station had an advertisement for Chinese rug at 9:45 a.m. or whatever. Let me get back to this. At the present time, it appears that the house with the dormer window at Lanikai at Kalama Bay may be the house which is owned by Otto Kuehn and his wife Friedel. And of course, at this time, they didn't know that the Navy officers were renting it out. Subject to the Honolulu Field Division File 65461, Mr. and Mrs. Friedel, Espionage G. These individuals have been the subject of considerable investigation by the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, as well as the Office of G2. No, the only evidence I have is the FBI so far. It is believed, although it is not established, that the Kuehns are the people who signaled from the house at the dormer window. Otto Kuehn and his wife, as well as their daughter Ruth Carson Moore, were picked up and interned on December 8th, 1941. It is also believed that the Kuehns and Mr. and Mrs. Friedel approached by the Japanese Consul General Honolulu more than a year and a half ago with information for the Japanese Navy. Now, this is the part to ponder on. And again, I've gone over this, but we don't have a transcription as we do with December 3rd of the wires that were sent that they refer to here. We have seen some hints at date fabrication in the files, although it's weak evidence and could be easily explained. And we do see some evidence in the FB files of of just repetitive dossier building and misattributed information, fictitious reports of confirmation of suspicion filling the file, but the presumption so far has been that at least the things that the FBI writes and puts in the file or have some basis of reality to it. You'd have to, to disregard what's going to be said here, you would actually have to believe that they were just making stuff up. And that's I'm not going to go that far with my argument. It's just okay. So I'm actually going to stop here, then I'll start with the next one.